following program is rated TVMA, LSGWBA. It contains strong language.
Guest tonight is Kevin McLellan, and how are you?
I'm good.
Yeah.
How are you, Antonio?
I'm good.
Awesome.
So let's the idea, as always, is we just have a conversation. There's not a lot of introductions. There's just, if you want any extra information about the poets, the books that you see during the show, you will find them in the website. That is textfornothingtv.com. So let's talk about your I don't know, where do you want to start? That's another thing.
Whatever you want to talk about.
Okay, let's start with the word you.
Oh, the word you.
Yeah.
The word you, the first thing I think about is a collection that is assembled and is currently being submitted to publishers. You is a project that uses the slash as its primary form of punctuation, and the U in the first section, it's not quite clear whether the U is a specific U or a self-reflexive U or the reader, or it's not clear.
Right.
But when the collection progresses, by the second section, you realize that it's a self-reflexive view.
Oh, I see. Well, because that was my other question. There's you have the manuscript of the whole book that is titled You.
That's
with
correct.
the forward slash, but also there's a lot of uses throughout your poetry of the word you.
That's correct.
And one of my questions was, who is that you? I mean, I know that's a big question, but it's just like, is the same you throughout the poems? Is a different you? Is like, how do you use that?
I use you a lot, and it depends upon. Could you give me an example?
Of course.
Yeah.
Now I have to find it.
Yeah, because it's like sometimes
put me on the
yous
spot
are
here.
me, sometimes yous are you, sometimes yous are.
Thank you for
specific-
sending the Sparrow Emissary. So you're thanking someone.
So that, I suppose, would be the theology part of the collection. It's called ornithology, which is a made-up word. And I am not necessarily a believer of the God as how most people know that God, which is not to say that I am not a spiritual or religious person.
Right.
But yes, I would say that you is a higher being.
So you use you in different ways throughout your poems.
That's correct.
And is there how does it come about? Like sometimes it seems like the poem is addressed to a certain particular person or a particular being,
Mm-hmm.
and you're using that pronoun. How does it work when you're writing? Like, do you know exactly, or is it something that you can change later?
I don't necessarily always start writing a poem using you. Sometimes I do. But there's something very there's something about that word that has, it's ambiguous, right? Like, you could be the reader when you're reading the poem, or the you could be the poet, myself, self-reflexive, or the you could be a specific you. And I like that ambiguity.
What?
In poetry. Why? It can allow for multiple readings. Or potentially read for it.
Right. Okay. And how does it happen when you're writing? Because that would make me think that you are not necessarily, but it comes up with could be like an idea. We were just talking about Mandelstam,
Right.
Before we started the show, and that he has that essay about the interlocutor. Mm-hmm. And then last week I was reading Paul Celan, and he has that you constantly use of that sort of other image or the image of the other. So how does it work for you in that sense? When you're writing, are you thinking of anything in particular, or it switches between poetically? How does it work in your composition?
Well, I'm really kind of obsessed. I'm going to take the back door with this question. I'm really obsessed with the prose of Maurice Blanchot. And he's obsessed with the self as other. And so I think somehow that influences when I'm writing. It just never leaves me. But the you doesn't necessarily always appear in a first draft. It's usually something that happens in revision if it's going to be that self-reflexive you.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So your first drafts are you work a lot on your manuscripts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So how does it start? Like when do you when you begin writing? Is it do you write on paper with a longhand? Do you write on computer? And how does that process work?
So it really depends upon where I am with the day. But most of the time lately, I prefer to work a first draft on paper, handwritten, and a revision definitely on the computer. I prefer to, if I'm working on a series of poems, meaning I know that there's going to be like many of them, I will use the same notebook. I will go to the same environment, and if I'm listening to music, I will listen to the same music.
Oh, wow.
It's very sort of, what would you call that?
Obsessive?
Obsessive, ceremonial is a nice word too.
Yeah, well, you have that poem that that showed me. You go to a coffee shop and you were listening to Bach.
Yes.
The Art of Fugue, and you were writing that.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
So that's a series of poems that's now called Winterberries, and that poem, essentially, I sat down at a coffee shop in Cambridge, and I would listen to the entire movement of Art of Fugue, which is it's 80 minutes, and I would just free write, and I did this 20 times. Not all 20 pieces ended up in the piece, and it was called The Art of Fugue, the piece that I was working on, but I was too tied to it, and the piece needed to transcend the music,
Wow.
even though it was influenced by the music, and so that was a really heartbreaking moment to sort of sever that connection to the music that was highly influential in what I was writing.
Right.
But the work itself is a progression of emotional responses to something medical that was going on in my life that was pretty traumatic.
Right. Right. So the music allowed you to access something in order to write, but then at the end you had to cut that.
That's correct.
So is that something that happens? Because that kind of brings me back to the you. And you said that you not necessarily that sometimes it comes out in revisions.
Right.
And it's almost like putting some distance. That reflexive you is a distance between the I.
That's correct.
And the sort of like putting that. Is that something you do consciously or just?
Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it isn't conscious. In regard to the Winterberries poem, that sort of, sometimes we need to get distance from something that is very close. And as difficult as it was to divorce myself from that music, or the piece to be divorced from that music, it was like, it was necessary. Because it was holding the piece back from being what it needed to be. It was too tied to the music. Even though it was influenced, it needed to be removed.
Huh. And how did I like? This is a question that might not be able to be answered. How did you feel that it was too tied to the music? That's it's a hard question, and I'm just interested in terms of how intuitively. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I have some wonderful friends in my life who are my readers, and it was a pretty consistent message.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that they felt that the poem would do better with a different context, a different title, because it was born out of that music, but it was not that music.
Right. Yeah, also you have the weight of that Bach as
Absolutely.
the classical composer,
Absolutely.
which weighs a lot if you're doing that.
Absolutely.
Also, like with the manuscript of You, and you mentioned it, that the forward slash is the only punctuation in that particular.
It's not the only punctuation. I think there are a couple of question marks, but there are no periods and no commas.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you, in other places, like in ordinary theology, you use brackets a lot, and you leave the brackets almost like it's not an erasure, but it seems like you're hiding or doing. There's empty spaces that are marked by the brackets.
Right.
So you have a particular use of those typographical symbols or characters. How did you come to use them, and how do you think them how they relate to your work?
Well, to have closed brackets with no information in them was a very different way of implementing silence.
Right.
And so for that particular poem in Ornithologhy, which is the last poem in the book, it just made sense. It was intuitive.
Right. So you use a lot of intuition
That's
when you're
correct.
writing.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your creative process. How does it work? Like, do you wake up in the morning and make a cup of coffee and make a cup of tea and sit down and?
It's usually not scheduled, and the best time for me to write is when there are no preoccupations, meaning that, something large that I need to do, like, I don't know, travel,
Right.
or although once I am traveling and settled, I can write. And sometimes even like if there are dishes in the sink, like that's not an optimal time to write.
Right.
Just to have things sort of tidy so that there's
Right.
nothing that's going to sort of interfere with my ability to connect with what I connect with when I write. And so that's important. And if I'm working on a series of poems, I need to use the same notebook. If I'm starting a new series, I need to use a new notebook. But I don't, like, for example, today I wanted to write.
Yeah.
And I knew that I needed to, I can't, sometimes outside influences, like say like other music, meaning what I mean by other music is music that's not, mine. Or sometimes I can't read other voices when I'm writing because I don't want their voices to influence what it is that I'm writing.
Yeah.
So there are many factors, but sometimes like I want to read someone and I'm okay with writing.
Right.
So it's really like, okay, what do we need today? And today I felt that I needed to not write at home. I felt that I needed to be in a cafe, and I felt that I needed to listen to my own music. I arrived there, I forgot my phone, music source,
Yeah.
and the cafe was full. And so I got nothing done.
So you went home.
So I went home.
Okay.
And there we have it. Nothing written.
And I really like what you just mentioned about the dishes, because in a lot of your poems there is an everyday aspect.
The domestic.
And there's a domestic element that is it's not idealized, it's not like an idyllic setting, it's like dirty dishes, or it's just, you have to go out shopping, or you have to come back and, water the plants, or
Right.
talk to your canaries. Things like in a very sort of concrete, everyday stuff that is like domestic space that I really appreciate. So why is that within the poems the way, because sometimes it has the same weight as other elements, or that as you used, like that transcendental you has that same sort of, almost like you talk to the sparrow and it's like the you. So like, how do you manage that? How do you navigate that?
Well, I live alone, so I think that there's something, and home to me is very important. I love the space where I live. I've lived in the same space for 13 years. I teach out of that space. It's for lack of better words, it's a sacred place. It's very important to me, and so there are things that need to happen there. And sometimes when I'm cooking,
Right.
for example, that can be a prime time for me to write.
When you're cooking.
When I'm cooking.
That's awesome. Why?
Yeah. I don't know. Like I think, cutting vegetables is just sort of like I'm like watching myself cut vegetables,
Right.
but the brain can wander.
Oh, right. So you kind of space out and you go.
I space out, and then all of a sudden I'll latch onto something that sort of came from nowhere, and
Right.
it ends up being like. So I think that I implement, or not implement, but sort of fold in these domestic moments. They are closely tied to my creative source.
Wow, that's kind of cool. And also another thing that is contrasted in your work, that one is not one, but one of many, but like we were just talking about the everyday, your domestic space. Is another one that is memory. And that sort of, how do you combine the two? Tell us a little bit more about your understanding of memory. And
It's unreliable memory, isn't it?
but that's why I like it.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of this French poet that says memory is not a historian, memory is a poet.
Mm-hmm.
So that the fiction is in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Memory is not a register.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that oftentimes what happens when I'm cooking is that I think about something, like a memory surfaces, right?
Right.
So either it's a new thought or it's a memory, and memories, I think they haunt us, don't they? Not necessarily in a negative way.
Yeah.
But when they return. I don't think it's accidental. It could be accidental. But it seems like when I remember something, it seems like it's for some reason, even if it doesn't seem so at that moment.
Right.
And so I think that there's agency there, right? And to sort of be able to sort of like, okay, I'm gonna drill down on this memory.
Right.
And where am I going to end up?
Someone like a analysis, I don't know what the word would be. It's not psychoanalysis necessarily, but it's a work.
An investigation.
On
An
yourself
investigation
and
of a
your
memory.
memories.
Yeah.
Huh. And that's led you to implement them in your work, or sometimes you're like they become too personal. Is there anything too personal you basically go like, I don't want to put this in writing?
It depends on the poem, I think. There in the Winterberry series, there are some really personal moments.
Right.
But again, I use punctuation to sort of fix that.
How?
I strike out the language that is very personal.
Oh,
so
like
it's there, but it's struck out.
Right, like a cross out. Is the word is there, but there's a cross out.
Yes.
Okay. Wow. Cool.
I don't know. I'm really obsessed with punctuation.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to. Why are you so upset with punctuation?
Punctuation is a tool that we can use to either expedite something or slow it down. It's a part of how the music moves. It regulates the music.
Right. Because it's curious because that is what I found out as a non-native English speaker is that English language poetry has a use of punctuation, unless it's a radical avant-garde modernist in that vein. It tends to still use punctuation to follow a logical, rational syntax.
Mm-hmm.
So when you break that, you're talking about the music and the rhythm and the flow of a poem that has nothing to do with in that sense, that sort of cognitive or rational part of speech, of
That's
language.
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Right.
I'm using punctuation unconventionally.
Right.
Yeah.
To like music and pauses.
That's
so in
right.
that sense, those the how you break the line is part of that.
That's correct. Yeah. I'm really obsessed with the sentence versus the line. There are a lot of my poems subvert the sentence so that an independent line has its own meaning, which may be counter to the meaning of the sentence.
Right. So like, would it be like the same words as a line and same words as a sentence?
No. So imagine that there is the first three words of a sentence ending a line that are joined. So we're talking about a enjambment.
Yeah.
So essentially we have the last few words of a sentence and the first few words of the next sentence on
Right.
one line.
Yeah.
That creates its own meaning, which
Right.
can subvert the actual meaning of both of those sentences.
Right. Okay. I understand.
Yeah.
Right. So that is
That is something that I enjoy doing.
why?
Why? Because I think that I feel like I make discoveries with language that way. And I think that for myself, like, that is the most satisfying thing as a writer, is to make discoveries with language. And that is one way of doing it. And,
Cool.
and as is, using punctuation in unconventional ways.
Right.
And form is another, right?
Yeah. Breaking the form and exploring language and yourself and the world through different forms.
That's correct.
Cool. So talking about forms, you are now also embarking in a different type of creative endeavor, which is a film.
That's correct.
So you're beginning to work with a different form. And so tell us a little bit about the creative aspect of, so how is it different working with film? Because there's also rhythm, there's also tempo, there's also pauses, or you can call them even punctuation. You can use different things as punctuation. So
Right.
how does that work for you?
Well, I think that I am making this film with another person, so it's a collaboration. And the writing of this short experimental film, which is titled Exordium, it's a very strange film. There are no faces shown in the film, and there's no dialogue. So the film is it focuses on hands. Hands are telling the story, as are etymological notes as captions in the film. And the etymological notes have some, how can I say this? Have some actuality to them, meaning that there's actual real information in there.
Yeah.
But we also stray from that, and we have sort of radicalized these etymological definitions for the purpose of the film. So in fact, we use the first person within these definitions
Right.
to make these definitions a person,
Yeah.
a character in the film. Another thing that we're using, and those etymological captions are between scenes, so they're acting as like hinges.
Oh, right, like a silent film. You have the,
So yes,
right.
so they help with the transition.
Right, and punctuating like a sentence.
Yeah. They're
exactly.
acting like the punctuation that I use in poetry.
Right.
So I guess that's one instance in which that's sort of transferable.
Right.
I guess the other thing, what else is there in the film that's sort of...
How did you start, like, how did you come to be interested in working with film? Like, has it always been there? I know you like cinema and you go to...
I love cinema.
You like watching films and you're interested in that. That's an art form. But how did you get into it as when you decided to like I also want to make films?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've made a couple of really short poetry videos, which I feel like one of them was like really, I feel like it failed in its content, but in its production, it succeeded very well. And then the other one, I felt that the content was really successful, and the production failed.
Right.
So I've been sort of, I don't know, experimenting with film these past 2 or 3 years. My collaborator I worked with at MIT, and I just asked her on this day in which she said, all I want to do is make art. And I said, do you want to collaborate? And she said, yes. And that's how we're making this film.
Right.
There's something about collaboration is also really important to me too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like we've run out of time.
Wow, that was fast.
I know it goes fast. That was this has been Text for Nothing, Conversations with Poets with my friend Kevin McLellan, and I'll be back in a month. All the information, and you can watch this on YouTube. You can watch it directly on the website. That is textfornothingtv.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think no. I think they can still hear us, but
That was super